Hi, hello, hello. So today we have a fabulous guest, and if you follow my podcast, you might have seen him already a few years back. He's a good friend of mine, Brice Scheschuk. Did I say it right? Okay, yeah, thank you.
Perfect, perfect.
For a good friend of mine, I should be able to pronounce your name properly, but it's still always a challenge. So last month we ran into each other at a restaurant, and we had the time to catch up around a drink. And Brice was telling me about one of his great new presentation on funders and discussing about VC and raising money. And I was just like, okay, I love that message. We need to absolutely get it out more. So just to give a bit of feedback on Brice for those of you, I'm sure not many of you don't know Brice, but if you don't know Brice, he has built, he has scaled, he has exited companies, he has raised, he has deployed capital. He's a great mentor, actually, to the next generation of Canadians. And his last initiatives, and I guess I can give the name of the presentation, which is Founders Play Your Own Game. I love it. Is part tough love and part strategic blueprint. And I think it's a super, super important message. We're going to go right into it now. I don't want to make more intro. If you want to add to that, Brice, you jump into it. But okay, so you have called raising capital one of the most consequential and irreversible decision a founder can make. So why do so many founders get it wrong? What inspired your message? And was there a particular, I don't know, experience or just recurring things that made you go in that direction now?
Okay, first of all, great to be back, Peggy. I think you are the only podcast that I will have been on twice. So I thank you for the invite back. And yeah, this is a much different discussion than we had the last time with a whole new topic. I will give 1 minute of background just so that it frames
Yep.
why I'm doing this, and then we'll answer very specifically the irreversible consequential. So we sold our operating businesses about a decade ago.
Mm-hmm.
We decided as a group of partners to stay together, use our capital, build an investment platform with the heaviest skew I've seen in Canada, at least, with a family office to venture tech and innovation. Fast forward 10 years, and the results of that now can be kicked out. We've cut 130 direct company checks, and we've invested in about 50 venture funds as LPs. So we have a lens of statistical significance that I think have given us a platform and a set of data that we can now talk to in a very interesting way, and we are beholden to no one.
So that answers the why now. You have the data and statistically relevant data. Yeah.
Yeah, and the second part to why now is that if you look at 16 to 25, 2016 to 2025, I break it into the following phases, which also help illuminate. From 16 to 19, we have what I call kind of a pretty heady time for venture. We have definitely the full rise of software. We have valuation increasing, kind of a risk on, risk on, risk on. In 2020, we have that 3 or 4 months of the pandemic where everyone was in chaos and uncertainty in our ecosystem. But then we moved to the next phase, which was stimulus and zero interest rates and digital transformation as a result of COVID. And that resulted in what I will call, I think it was as big a bubble as .com one, just in a slightly different way. The back half of 20, all of 21, and then the front half of 22. And then in the back half of 22, rates go up, Russia invades Ukraine, inflation, and so on. And we have this massive crash of that bubble.
Yeah.
And now we have two different narratives playing. One is the continuation of the companies that over-raised, made a lot of wrong moves in that bubble era, trying to kind of figure out life still. Many have died, many have had other problems.
Yep.
And the rise of a new bubble narrative, which is AI. Okay. So if I take all of that, I already had a not-for-profit that I've been running for a number of years on mentorship, on resilience, on a bunch of topics. A year ago, almost to the day, Uniting the Prairies, which is a Saskatoon-based conference for prairie founders, said, would you do the keynote? And I said, yes. And I've been thinking about a new topic. And I told them about Founders Play Your Own Game. And I went out there and I did it to about 300 or 400 people. And while I was on the stage, I said, anyone who wants this deck, hit me on LinkedIn. 250 people reached out and said, we want this deck.
Yeah, that's a good ratio out of 400.
Very good ratio. And it resulted in today having done it 32 or 33 times. I still do it. I'll still do it a few more before the summer kind of kicks in. And my by far best received narrative that I've ever done in our ecosystem.
Okay, so that leads me to another question we can take after. Why do you think it's so well received? And maybe you want to explain more, okay, why you get there and all that, but I'm very curious to know why. Maybe because people have seen the up and down and they're finally ready, but...
Yeah, so I would say two reasons. Number one is the people are more knowledgeable after going through the downtimes as to the fact that maybe one should take a sober second look at some of this stuff. And number two is that, I say it this way, actually, 99.999% of the oxygen in our ecosystem as it relates to capital is why you should raise VC, high velocity, high valuation, growth.
I know.
Right?
Yeah.
99.999% of the companies in our ecosystem should not raise venture capital.
I agree.
So we have this massive disconnect, and the message is starting to get through, and it's getting through more, interestingly, in the US, where there has been a rise of a counter narrative to venture. And in Canada, the narrative hasn't risen as much, but we are influenced by the US. I would suggest that I'm probably the most vocal voice in our ecosystem trying to balance it. And it's not an indictment of an asset class. It is a balancing narrative to try to take some of the oxygen towards a rational narrative.
Exactly. And I mean, it was a function as well of the economic environment, so much capital. So it was thrown at if there had been higher interest rate earlier, there would have been way less flooding of capital to companies. So it was more, unfortunately, a problem looking for a solution versus the other way around. So let's go back to why do you think raising capital is the most consequential and irreversible decision a founder can make?
So here's how, so the act of raising capital, and by the way, raising capital is super interesting. The choice to not raise capital is also part of the capital narrative.
Absolutely.
So if you decide to bootstrap, or if you decide to stay super lean and take very little dribs and drabs of capital, which changes generally your growth rate, changes your dilution, changes the control levers, the governance. So those are all choices.
Yeah.
And why is it irreversible and consequential? The act of deciding how you fund your business determines the growth that you need to meet the requirements of that capital. The reverse engineering of the likelihood and the actions that need to be taken to understand market, product, customer, and in particular, go-to-market math. The earlier you take capital, the less you know about that, the more risk, the lower probability of an outcome. The dilution that you take, the loss or maintenance of control, the culture that you set. Generally speaking, there's some beautiful quotes from bootstrap founders around how and often they took some type of institutional capital later than the average. They talk about being able to stamp their culture. Toby Lutke at Shopify talks about how Shopify was a modest company. Maybe it was Canadian humility, him spending 6 years in the wilderness trying to figure out market, product, customer, seeing the math of his go-to-market, and then raising confidently and understanding in a very balanced narrative with the other side, Bessemer in this case, as to what we were both expecting, and so on and so forth. So, and often what I find is founders, this is a bit crazy in some ways, and maybe I was like this too, but they don't understand the core dimensions of what the other side is looking for
Mhm, mhm, mhm.
and what it requires in terms of growth and return,
Yeah. Mhm.
and how does it portfolio construct and so on.
Yeah. Mhm.
And so this all is consequential, right? And as I like to say on irreversible, it's easy. Once you take money into your company, you can't give it back.
Yeah. It's a bit like a favor with the mafia.
Exactly.
You gave that handshake. Now
Exactly.
you're F.
Perfectly said. That's
But
awesome.
there is one thing. So I used to do a presentation like that a lot to female entrepreneurs and female investors, especially entrepreneurs. And I was always telling them, capital is not just equity from VC. It can be non-dilutive grants. It can be debt. At the time, debt was less expensive. But if you believe in the future of your company, and as an entrepreneur, you have no choice but believe that. Otherwise, you go insane. Equity is the most expensive source of capital you can have. It's very, but to your point, and I think you're making a very good point. I'm from finance. So for me, I came the other way around, understanding very well how everything worked and being able to see it is not working for most companies because to your point, if you reverse engineer the data, it's not working. But I never really thought about it that way. That's true. If you're an entrepreneur, you don't necessarily understand the mechanic and what corner you're putting yourself into. Same thing with the handshake with the mafia. If you don't know what it means, you think you're just helping someone delivering a package. Well, now it's turning into something very different.
Exactly. I'll tell you one thing. I've been over the last 5, maybe even 10 years since we sold, I've gotten super into broad-based investing concepts. And I've
Mm-hmm.
become just such a massive fan of Charlie Munger, Warren
Oh,
Buffett's business
mm-hmm.
partner, obviously passed. And he has a quote that I use a lot. And it's actually, the way he says it is, just tell me where I'm going to die and I'll never go there. And what people interpret that as is the concept of inversion, always looking at it from the other side.
Uh-huh.
What could go wrong? What is the outcome required and how do we reverse engineer to that? And so I have this long narrative with founders where I talk about you are going to have a spreadsheet that is going to be the most beautiful thing because you all have it. And it's growth up and to the right, never a pause,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
perfect metrics,
Okay,
everything
stick.
is.
Yeah, exactly.
And I said, great, you're going to have that. No one's going to believe it, but you're going to show it because you have to. What I want you to do is I want you to model your business as if you had to bootstrap. You put a funding
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
constraint on it
mm-hmm.
and you show the behaviors and actions and how you would build that business separately. And I also want you to model a scenario where you take some capital in and you hit an inevitable plateau and you can pick how you think about dealing with that. And so back to what you're saying is the just dropping into founders' brains thought exercises that hopefully allow them to think a little bit more expansively and broadly and maybe even tilt their gears where they're like, oh, wait a second, I don't need that much capital. I
Mm-hmm.
don't need capital that
Exactly.
early. I'm
Exactly.
going to cut a bunch of clutter out. If I raise capital, I have to spend it.
Yeah.
And some of the spend, well, as you and I both know, we've been doing this for a long time. A lot of that spend will never make sense. Focus, remove distraction, all
Yeah.
these it all gels in this narrative.
Yeah. Yeah. So if I look from more a private equity later stage value creation aspect, one of the first thing I look is the cap table. If a company, maybe it's now stable, maybe it's Series F, doesn't matter. But if a company has taken a lot of external capital, I know they're going to be less capital efficient. Because to your point, they would have had, it's a bit like you're telling me, Peggy, you have to spend 5 million this year. Well, that's way higher than my usual run rate. You're going to start buying stuff because you have to. And I think it's a very good point. So just looking the other way around. So when should a funder then decide whether to pursue VC? Because sometimes it's the right thing to do. How do you see that? What company should actually, first, what are the questions an entrepreneur should ask themselves? Maybe a litmus test kind of. And you gave us already a few insights, but when does it make sense?
So I am a firm believer that we can never have perfectly binary rules. You know that, and I know that. It's not deterministic. But if I could generalize in looking at the research I've done around enduring, successful winners, so those that made it, they weren't forced to sell too early. They didn't do silly things with too much capital early. They didn't get buried under pref stacks too early. You'll hear a theme, too early. The ones that I have seen in our ecosystem be successful, generality is they stayed lean. This includes categories like even deep tech. Okay. They've stayed lean and they focused on market, product, customer. Most people neglect the customer. You and I know that well. They focus on that. They are maniacal about domain expertise of whatever their area is. And they are amazingly good at cutting out the distractions that suck a founder's cognitive load to all the fires of the day.
Yeah.
And they do that. I use Toby as the example, but there are so many. Okay. Toby no one talks about this with Shopify. He spent 6 years trying to figure out whether he had a business at Shopify. Over the course of that first 6 years, he raised $1 million of angel capital from his father-in-law and from a guy named John Phillips. Okay. No one talks about modesty and humility with Shopify. They all think it's Toby who's just the most successful human in Canada. No. 6 years. At the end of those 6 years, he had $1 million in the bank. So he had basically in the bank what he had raised. So he was sustained. He ran 5 growth experiments of $50,000 each. They all hit. He's a very foundational first principles thinker. He said, maybe I need to look at my business differently. Maybe I'm not a small business, a mighty middle or whatever term you want to use company. He had been working on metrics to see how his business was doing, and he found Bessemer's memos that help founders think about metrics that matter and so on. He goes down to the valley, decides to raise 10 on 120, and now we have a story. He, at the point of that raise, think about everything that's in place there in that example versus a pre-seed founder who's done 3 months at YC, comes out of a demo day, gets put in front of the VC ecosystem, is offered 3 million on 30, has a PowerPoint deck and a bit of presence, doesn't understand market, product, and customer. The person he's raising that money from is going to be power law by nature and is betting on 150 or 100 of that guy, and they need 100x outcome on 1 or 2 of their companies. So the bet being made on me at 3 on 30, I actually use 1 on 10, which is the median pre-seed raise, is $1 billion outcome, and you don't know anything. Toby raised at a point where he knew a lot. And so if I could summarize what I say to founders is the more you can know more about actually market, product, customer, and most importantly, yourself. Do you want to be that type of an outlier founder and enter that treadmill? The more you can nail those 4 dimensions, the far higher probability of a successful outcome you will have. Point, click, care, light speed, full script, stack adapt, some of the ones that roll off our tongue in our ecosystem that we all know. They did not do that pre-seed, spend on growth maniacally and sillily, and then end up adding pref, dilution and dilution, and losing control of the narrative. That's what I saw.
So that's super interesting because 2 things. First, humility, which is something that as Canadian, even if I was born and raised in France, we kind of beat ourselves down for that. The fact that, oh my God, we're not, and especially in that context, we're not raising as much money as in the US. We're not, like as ambitious as in the US. But what you're showing me is actually, it's almost the other way around, is that we shot ourselves in the foot by using a playbook that is not aligned with who we are, what makes sense. And the US is a different market, it's a bigger market as well. people who have also a very different mindset than Canadian, let's be honest. So we actually played that humility against us. Well, actually, it was our biggest strength based on what you were talking about with raising capital and understanding your business before taking money.
You said it perfectly.
Yeah.
Our weapon here is actually lean building, and that requires a humility and a modesty, and then a decision at the right time to decide how you want to capitalize when you know. And the Valley is an interesting animal, and it's a unique animal that people should not try to copy.
Exactly.
If you want to play that game, go to the place that is the best at it. The other thing that I'll say, Peggy, is that the US, again, is such a vast market that this narrative that we're talking about, the loudest voices about the balancing narrative are in the US. There are many constituents that recognize this issue because it is the same in the US in terms of likelihood of failure, probability of success, And so I could give you 5 podcasts. Actually, I'll give you one right now. Practical Founders. Okay, it was built on the back of this narrative. The guy has interviewed probably now 120 founders that followed the lean style. It's never ending. People that have built 20, 30, 40, 50 million revenue businesses, not with zero capital, but with non-institutional VC capital. Right. And it's a beautiful, it's like it. So we just need, and we are not indicting VC. We just need people to be thoughtful about the various ways to do this and to own it on their terms by having knowledge. And then the other thing that I'll say, and you actually said it so well, I wear t-shirts when I present with slogans on them because I want to send messages. On the back of these t-shirts now, I have the words conventional wisdom with a circle around them and a strikeout. And you made one example. Okay, so what do we tell founders now? You enter an accelerator, it's a programmatic thing to try to get you to a demo day in front of investors. I would suggest to you that's the anti-humility modesty narrative. Conventional wisdom would say you should do the accelerator way. I say do the opposite. Conventional wisdom in institutional land is you should not bother with any kind of services revenue. That's evil. It's low multiple. It distracts you, right? Well, I'll tell you one story that I find fascinating. In my speaking tour on this topic, I go to McGill and I do my spiel. 2 guys come up to me and they ask me a question that's a very interesting question. They say, Brice, should we quit school? And I'm like, oh, that is actually a rare question for me and an interesting question. Please give me some context. 2 guys, 2nd year commerce at McGill. They said, we've started a consulting business around AI on the side of our desks. I'm like, amazing. They said, yeah, we're going to do, I think they said $500,000 in revenue, spending like 15 or 20% of our time, between school, this. We are funneling that money into a product idea that we have that we are building, AI or whatever. And I said, I didn't tell them whether they should quit school or not. I gave them the pros and cons. But I have been using this example because what is your alternative to get 500 grand into your business at those young guys? Well, you would go to our institutional market. You would say pre-seeders, here's my idea, here's my and I'm looking for $500,000 to $1 million, and it'll be a $10 million valuation because that's what it is now. And you're engineering yourself for a power law 100x outcome. And I'm like, wait a second, 15, 20% of your time, $500,000, you're learning so much while you're building that product on your own dime, spending it so smartly because it's your own money, with no dilution, knowing more about those dimensions every single day. So every aspect of what we're training founders, to me, if you actually invert and say, is that conventional wisdom make sense? I think you can find a counter narrative that is very powerful.
And that's when we arrive and you're like, can I put a check in your business?
Exactly. That's the guy you want to fund, right?
And so it has been something I've seen, like I work with VCs and I've been on board with that sometimes, and again, to your point, it's not an indictment of VCs, like they're unnecessary players in the ecosystem. It's just that we give them too much power in VC was the answer from zero to in any scenario. So I think that's the challenge we've had. It's not VCs, is what we made VC of. But in some companies, I see VC killing companies, because again, the money, the pressure, the money was too big, it was too early, pressure on boards were, just unrealistic. The founders get kicked out for a CEO that is the entrepreneur in residence of the VC, And I've seen people losing their companies. And to your point, these are not stories we really hear about.
Everything you just said there, founder out for an EIR, over-raised in the hype cycle, too big of a pref stack, could never grow into valuation.
Exactly.
Co-founder breakup pressure, raising too much too early, and the list would go on and on and on. We have many examples of each of those. Yeah. And when you ratio it, what you actually find, and this relates right back to multi-decades of data, is one company succeeds for every 49 either pure failures, which most are pure failures, so no return of capital to investors, let alone founders, or very poor outcomes that if you would have thought about your business differently, you probably have a better chance of ownership and so on and so forth. Every example you said, I've seen many times.
And that's the opportunity cost. So that's exactly, what you just mentioned. It's also the opportunity cost is what you end up with versus what you could have ended up with. And people don't necessarily run the 2-3 scenarios at the same time. So I have one last question. You're a big advocate of, mindset training and, entrepreneurial resiliency. So I should actually have 2 questions. What does a mentally strong founder looks like? Because it is extremely difficult to be a founder. That's the reality. So what does it look like? But also you mentioned something else that I love, which is really this paradox that every bootstrapped founder wants more capital and every funded founder wants more control. So I let you, we don't have much time, I let you pick which one you want to answer. If you want to answer both, that's great. Go for it.
Okay, so really great. The second one, so every bootstrap founder wants more capital, every funded founder wants more control. We can all think of this scenario where a bootstrap founder is really doing their job, and then the Silicon Valley equivalent business raises $100 million and tries to compete. The way I end that little slogan is I actually add 2 more words. I say mindset wins. So I have founders that I've seen that actually start to break a little bit mentally when the 5th and 7th and 10th company announces a $50 million raise and they're bootstrapping. What I try to say to them on the counter is I'm like, you should actually be happy that some of that is happening.
Market validation,
market education, a complete misspend. They will hit a plateau and most of those companies die. Yeah. And if you can sustain, you will pick up the positive pieces of that. Yeah. I had a founder tell me who was more on the bootstrap side. When he started, it was in compliance. There were 14 or 15 competitors. He said he lasted about 15 years before he sold. And by the time he sold, he was down to 3 meaningful competitors just because of the way consolidation and death happens. So I say that a lot to founders, but I want to move back to your former point. So I do a 1-hour workshop called Building the Skills for Entrepreneurial Resilience. And I do it for a very similar reason to Founders Play Your Own Game. I found it to be I look for white space topics that people are not commercially filling with a company that I think are useful for founders and allow me to give some impact and give back. And I love presenting. So I do one on building the skills for entrepreneurial resilience, and it was driven by what we saw happen with founders in the early stage of the pandemic. And where it's gotten to, and we've done a lot of research, 100 interviews with resilience experts and so on, is we break it into 3 categories. Number 1 is personal, number 2 is team, and number 3 is organizational. And we like to say, first of all, people don't even understand the definition. What do we mean by resilience? Well, you're cruising along and a stressor hits, a pandemic, and it knocks everyone off. Resilience is the ability to get back to where you were before the stressor as quickly and efficiently and strongly as possible. And Taleb, a very famous author that many people know, wrote a book called Anti-Fragile. He actually goes a step further and said a resilient person, team, organization will actually look for the stressor to get stronger and win in it. So we take those three and we break them into 19 principles. And generally speaking, I would say to you, they are also unconventional. So whereas our industry would say there are only two pieces of advice I will give you, raise more capital and work more hours.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. There's actually a well-being narrative in here where the 81st hour is probably better spent in the week actually doing something outside of your business because it makes you stronger for the next week.
Exactly.
And so we go through this narrative of unconventional principles around decision-making, around well-being, around post-mortem team thinking, around trying to set up a board that doesn't just have 25-year-old VC associates that know nothing, and so on and so forth. And so it would be too long to answer it perfectly, but what I will say is, in general, be very careful with conventional advice on how to deal with stressors and think about your own well-being in that one corner of your brain that helps to balance the entrepreneurial obsession. And there are lots of actions there.
Yeah.
So I'll stop with that.
That's a fabulous point to start, because I do believe that with this idea of raising more capital, the hustle culture has done massive damage to the entrepreneurs, psyche, financial situation, and that's a great message. You'll have to come back to explain
Anytime. We could do a whole resilience,
the
right?
19 principle, exactly, because I totally agree with you. I think the conventional wisdom is usually wrong because it's an average, but we're not average. So something that's going to work for you is not going to work for me. Or even something that works for you today is not going to work for you in a month. And to be able to realize that, you need to understand that you need to monitor yourself. And for that, you need a lot of self-awareness, which doesn't come like that. So I love that you finished with that idea of well-being. So thank you so much, Brice. That was like super interesting. I had no doubt it will be the case. And good luck with, like the presentations around Canada, because I think it's a fabulous message.
Awesome. And Peggy, so I love hanging out with you. Generally, look forward to the next glass of wine. Thank you for doing all of this. Okay, you're getting a great message out there, and just keep pounding. We need great people talking to our ecosystem and teaching. So thanks so much.
Thank you so much, and we'll put you on deck for September, maybe. Thank you so much. Have a great day. Take care.
Bye-bye.